Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit before we got on. You said that you didn't want me to give away the whole class here, and kind of what you said relates to that. That this is something which compounds. Like I could talk about Isaiah for 10 hours, and all that would do is give me and you and everyone else 100 hours more things to say about it. Because with every connection, it generates 10 more connections. And the coolest thing, the paradoxical thing, the extraordinary thing, is that all of these connections are all really there because
Yeah.
what's inside the world is the logi of the God who is infinite. And that's what the Bible is all about as well.
This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Seraphim Hamilton. Most of you would know Seraphim. He's been on my channel a few times. I've been on his, and he has also already given a class for the Symbolic World. And there is a new class that is going to start very soon, starting June 15th, on Isaiah and the messianic aspects of Isaiah, kind of diving in to the book. I'm definitely looking forward to it. But first of all, I have just found out that Mr. Seraphim is in seminary. It's good to talk to you.
It's great to talk to you too. And it is kind of good to be back from my sabbatical temporarily for the purposes of this class. I'm really excited to get back into the nitty gritty of scripture and Christology and all that kind of stuff here.
And so how are you, you're a smart guy. This is the thing. How are you able to go back to school? Are you enjoying it?
Yeah. Yeah. We have a really cool set of professors here. And I've been able to kind of get into some of the issues that I enjoy from a little bit of a different angle, make use of the library that is on campus here, and, branch out a little bit into especially liturgical stuff. I mean, I have a lot of head knowledge about scripture and symbolism and that kind of stuff. But honestly, it's just really cool to be able to put together a Vespers service. And that sheds light on all the sorts of symbolic stuff that we're into anyway. So it's a different angle, but I am really enjoying it.
Yeah, I'm kind of jealous. I'm kind of jealous. I'm too old, and a lot of complicated things would not make it possible. So, all right. So when I saw that you were going to put together a course on Isaiah for us, then my first reaction was Isaiah. Why Isaiah? Of all the books in the Old Testament, why Isaiah? What is it about Isaiah that attracted you to want to give a course on it?
So I think the big thing about Isaiah that drew me in years ago is the fact that Isaiah is very, very famous as a Christological book of the Old Testament. Now, everybody knows the whole Old Testament is Christological, but when people think about, okay, where is Jesus talked about? Where's the most famous prophetic texts about him? They think about Isaiah. They think about a virgin will conceive and bear a son, which is, controversial for some reasons. We'll get into that in the class. They think about the suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53, one of the most extraordinary passages in the Old Testament, because people read it who aren't familiar with the fact that this is in the Old Testament, and they say this is a Christian text about Jesus. So you have these images from the book of Isaiah, which people associate with Christ. But you can tell from the chapter numbers I just gave you, Isaiah 7, Isaiah 53, this is a really big book. It's not the longest prophetic book in the Old Testament, but it's definitely up there. And there's a huge range of imagery in the book, which, if Christianity is true, if Jesus really is the Messiah, all must pertain to Christ in one way or another. So I remember when I was really just starting to get into the Old Testament in 2013, I was flying back to where I was going to college at the time, and I just had my little ESV Bible, and on the plane I opened it up and I just read through the whole book of Isaiah, and I didn't really understand what I was reading for the most part. But as the images kind of washed over me, you see the Lord with the sword in his hand striking down the dragon that is in the sea. And you see, there's something there. There's something very profound that's there. And then over the years that followed, I began to see that the text of Isaiah is constructed in a very intentional way that links it not only intratextually, that is, links the
Mhm.
various parts
Yeah.
with other parts of the book, but intertextually with the rest of the Old Testament, and then the New Testament builds on that and draws Isaiah forward into the gospel of Christ. And that when you see these connections, all kinds of incredible things emerge, things that are just, when they first were manifest to me, are just unbelievable. Like, we read Isaiah 53, that sounds like Christ, but there's so much more in Isaiah, which just leaps out at you and shows you that the kind of high Christology of the New Testament is not really just the high Christology of the New Testament. It's a high Christology in the Old Testament, and that can be demonstrated from so many different directions. And so it's a really rich and sophisticated book that also gives you an incredible vision of the entire creation, because Isaiah, like so much of the Old Testament, is written in the language of creation. That is, it's about seed, right? And
Mhm.
seed isn't just a metaphor. It's not like, oh, seed means offspring, period. No. A seed is something which goes into the ground and produces a tree. And it
Mhm.
also means offspring because people are like trees. And there's all sorts of cool things that you can do with that. It's not just that, oh, there's this divine fire, that's coal in this one chapter. Oh, that symbolizes the presence of God. And oh, that's cool. We use it in the liturgy when the priest is communing. No, that passage illuminates all the other uses of fire inside and outside of Isaiah. And then you read that forward into the liturgy and you realize there's actually a lot of other connections between this chapter and the context of the liturgy in which it's happening. So Isaiah is just a really exciting book, which is a kind of key to seeing the unity between the testaments and the unity between the Bible and creation through the eyes of the church. And I, when you see things come together in that way, it's exhilarating because it says something about God, who's the source of all unity.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really excited to see how you talk about this because, for example, these intuitions that we have, it's also that there's this interesting thing that happens. Like, there's like a play of symbolism that happens between the books where, so for example, in Isaiah, you have obviously the image of God smiting the Leviathan, right?
Mm.
And then in the book of Revelation, it says that Saint Michael kills the great dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, well, this is the same event. Like, this is the same event, but it's being described with two different languages. On the one hand, the Leviathan isn't named in the book of Revelation, but it's named in Isaiah. And then in Isaiah, it doesn't say that it's the angel of the Lord that does it. And so there's this interesting thing where like you said, it illuminates other aspects of the Bible, where when you see the angel of the Lord in certain places, it's like, well, this is God's action. He's doing it through this angel, but it's God acting also directly in a certain way.
There's really interesting things in Isaiah itself, which kind of illuminate those connections as they're made explicit in the New Testament. So let me give you an example. In Isaiah 27, we see the Lord take his sword and strike down the dragon that is in the sea. And one of the words that's used is, in fact, nachash, the word for serpent that's used in Genesis 3. And there's all kinds of evidence here in Isaiah.
Oh no, it's in Revelation that it says that it's the Leviathan. It says the Leviathan, the great Satan.
Well,
But
no,
in Isaiah, it doesn't say Leviathan.
it does say Leviathan, actually.
Okay, it does.
Yeah,
Okay,
it
sorry.
does say Leviathan in Isaiah 27. But it also links that Leviathan to the serpent of Genesis 3. And there's other things which indicate Genesis 3 is running in the background there. But then this theme of angel of the Lord, which you mentioned, which is also really cool, in Isaiah 36 to 39, you have a series of historical narratives, which are also found in the book of Kings. And one of these historical narratives is when Sennacherib, who's the king of Assyria at the time, comes and surrounds the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is about to fall. This is the context of Isaiah, by the way, the coming of the exile. The exile begins in the days of Isaiah. It's something people need to understand, that the exile is not a Babylonian thing. The exile begins the moment that the northern tribes start being deported. Then, it's just the completion of that over the next century and a half. In any case, Sennacherib sweeps away the northern tribes. He comes into Judah. I mean, he's winning this war. He is taking Judean territory, and then he comes to the capital, and the city is surrounded. And it looks like it's game over until Hezekiah, for the first time in Israel's history, despite the fact that Solomon told them to do this at the beginning, for the first time in Israel's history, a king from the house of David goes into the temple and uses it to pray. And he prays to the God of heaven, and then the angel of the Lord comes in the middle of the night and he strikes down the soldiers of Sennacherib so that Sennacherib has to turn tail and run home. So what that shows you is that there is a connection that is already being established in the text between the angel of the Lord and the Lord who takes a sword, strikes down the dragon. And actually, that rolls forward in the book of Isaiah because later we read about the angel of his presence who saved them in the days of the Exodus. So we see that these connections, they build on each other in a way that actually sheds light on the New Testament, just as the New Testament sheds light on the Old Testament. And what I want to emphasize about Isaiah, which is, and about the whole Bible, which is so exciting, is that these are not just cool images which get picked up and used by the apostles and the church fathers to say something about Christ, as if they didn't say something about Christ intrinsically. No, these connections are intrinsic to the structure of the text. And when you begin to see them, you can't unsee them. They're just everywhere.
Yeah, and I think this work is so important because, one of the things that people often say or have this intuition is that many of the references, let's say, from the Old Testament to the New Testament are kind of verses taken out of context, images taken out of context, but that what you see when you read the book, and I think that's what you're going to be able to show us, is that there's a deep structural relationship too. It's not just these images popped out of their chapters,
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things about the nature of the exile that is really important for people to understand, because I think this is where there's a lot of confusion about the way biblical prophecy works. People look at messianic texts in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, if we want to be PC. They look at the only people who call it Hebrew Bible, as a matter of course, are like academics. Jews call it the Tanakh, and Christians call it the Old Testament. Whatever, we can say any one of them. But when you look at these messianic texts in the Bible, you see that they cluster around this idea of the coming of the exile. And then when you look at the traditional Christian framing of what Jesus does for us, many people look at that and they say, what does this have to do with this idea of exile? So what I want to show in the course of the class is the way that the theme of exile actually does pertain to this cluster of traditional Christian themes. So when you think about the coming of the exile in the days of Isaiah, what is the coming of the exile really about? Well, it's the king of Assyria who initiates the exile. And then a century and a half later, the king of Babylon completes it. Both events are actually mentioned in the book of Isaiah, right? So Isaiah 36 to 39, you have these historical narratives about the coming of the kings of Assyria, Sennacherib, and then you have a prophecy that the king of Babylon is going to finish it. What people need to understand is that Assyria and Babylon are not two separate powers in the scriptural narrative. Assyria and Babylon are two fragments of a single polity. We see this in Genesis 10 to 11. In Genesis 10 to 11, the city of Cain, we can call it archetypally the city of man, the social and cultural embodiment of rebellion against God, is refounded by Nimrod, and it's called Babel or Babylon. It's the same word. And Nimrod, he conquers the land of Assyria. So the king of Babylon is the king of Assyria. And what God does is he then cuts it up. He says, no, mankind is not going to be integrated into a single polity defined by rebellion against the divine will. You're going to separate them and they're going to fight with each other, right? So then that happens throughout the history of the ancient world. Assyria and Babylon, they fight with each other. They both understand they're related polities, but they fight with each other. When Assyria comes back to the fore in kind of the early to mid first millennium BC, this is a reassertion of this primordial world imperial power. And when you read that in the canonical context of the whole Bible, you realize that this power is a manifestation of the power that we read about in Genesis 3 and following. Because in Genesis 3, we have this heavenly being who appears. The Nachash it's a serpent, but it's a heavenly being. Serpentine imagery is associated with angels and gods throughout the ancient world. And then in Genesis 4, we see the terrestrial manifestation of that in this primordial city of man. And so when you find the king of Assyria coming into the land of Judah in the days of Isaiah, this isn't disconnected from this primordial story of human rebellion against God, exile from the divine presence, and the involvement of these supernatural powers with that original rebellion.
All right, we need to break this down for people because
This is Seraphim Hamilton. The imagery of Isaiah is overwhelming. Fire, stone, seed, life, and death. What does it have to do with Christ? Join me for my course, The Fifth Gospel, to discover how to read Isaiah in terms of its native language, symbolism. When we read that language along the textual structure of the book, we find the story of Christ, the God who became man to elevate man to divine glory. And we find that story both in Isaiah's most famous passages and in his most obscure ones. The course starts on June 15th and can be attended live or at your convenience. I hope to see you there.
all right, we need to break this down for people because in Isaiah, of course, is the famous text, one of the famous texts out of which our idea of the fall of Satan comes, right? And in that text, you have exactly this weird relationship that gets set up between the king, between this notion of the serpent in the garden, and also this idea of the cherub as well, right? And so you maybe you can break that down for us now, because I've always tell people, when to get to Satan, the way that we have Satan, you have to really dive into the deep analogies of Scripture. It's not there at face value, because that text doesn't talk about Satan. It talks about a king, the king.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I wasn't immediately thinking of that, but there's so much to say about Isaiah.
Well, because you said you talked about the serpent and then the rebellion and the king of Assyria, and I'm like, well, let's go there.
Well, there we go. Isaiah 14 is where these things come together. So Isaiah 14 talks about the king of Babylon when he is going to be dethroned, when he's going to be placed under the earth, and who's going to rise up to meet him is actually the Rephaim, who are, it's another word for this kind of Nephilim type of creature we meet in Genesis 6. You don't have to get into all that right now, but the Nephilim idea is associated with this figure in Isaiah chapter 14. So the figure is called the king of Babylon. He's also called the Daystar, the son of the dawn. Now, one of the meanings of the word Nachash, this is a little bit controversial, but I think it can be vindicated from a variety of different directions. Michael Heiser made this argument. One of the meanings of Nachash is bright one or luminous one. So it's translated serpent, but it also is related to the idea of brightness. It's also related to the idea of divination. So we have this idea, this heavenly being, this luminous one who's described in serpentine terms. Now, when you read Genesis 3 to 11, what you find, as I suggested or alluded to, is that the founding of the tower and city of Babel is part of the same story of that serpentine figure's influence on the human race. And what the tower and city of Babel are, is they are not just an attempt to unify all mankind, but it's a way of unifying heaven and earth. It's a way of unifying the celestial and the terrestrial realm. And this is part of kind of the common language of symbolism in the ancient world, which is that the king is a representative of the gods. The king is a member of the divine council. Like there's certain rituals where in many cultures the king becomes a deity or becomes a participant in the divine council. And so when we read Isaiah 14, when we read about someone called the Daystar, the son of the dawn, who's a king of Babel or Babylon, one who is exalted above the stars of heaven, but is going to be cast down under the earth in death, where he's going to meet the Rephaim, the spirits of the Nephilim, another attempt to unify heaven and earth in a false way, by the way. We are dealing with something which is not just like, oh, it's this particular king of Babylon at this particular moment in time. No, the text is written in a way so that it links these historical reference with the big story. Right? It links the power of Babel, of Babylon, with the primordial heavenly power who led mankind astray and brought all this kind of destruction into the world. Another interesting thing about Isaiah 14 is that if you read Isaiah along its kind of overarching literary structure. One of the most common structures in the Bible is a chiasm. Most people have heard the word chiasm. Some people are worn out by the claims of chiasms in the Bible. Some of them are more easily demonstrable than others. This one I think is pretty easily demonstrable, that Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 53, the description of the suffering servant, are chiastically related. That is, they occupy analogous positions in the literary structure of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that can then be confirmed from another direction, because actually there's all kinds of links between these two texts. When you read Isaiah 14 about the king of Babylon, who exalts himself above the stars of heaven and then is taken down under the earth in the grave, and then you read that with the story of Isaiah 53, it's actually a precise inversion of that. In Isaiah 53, what you have the servant of the Lord who will be exalted above all things, who will be high and lifted up. But what happens to him? What happens to him is that he freely, in silence, like a lamb led to the slaughter, he makes his grave with the wicked. He goes under the earth freely and then is exalted above the stars of heaven. So it's not only that they seem to occupy an analogous position in the literary structure of the book, but that points you to further connections in between these two texts, which show that they're actually related to each other. So when I read Isaiah 14, I don't actually read this as kind of like a biography of Satan's past.
Right. Yeah.
I think this is a prophecy of his destruction. This is it's written in the perfect. Some scholars would call this the prophetic perfect. It's written as if it is already completed, because a prophecy is so sure that it might as well be already completed. So the Isaiah 53 is written in the same tense. Who has believed their report, to whom has the arm of the Lord already been revealed, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a prophecy of the destruction of that primordial serpent, who is identified as the king of Babel, the king of Babylon, because that's the real ruler of this power. And then that shows up in Revelation, because Revelation has various references to Isaiah 14. It talks about a star which is fallen from heaven. That's there in Revelation chapter 8, or chapter 6, pardon me. And that phrase is straight out of Isaiah 14. And so we see these connections between these texts. It shows that we're dealing with a supernatural power in Isaiah 14. It also shows Isaiah 53 that the servant of the Lord seems to be a messianic figure. Because who's the opposite of the king of Babylon? It's the king of Zion. And this shows we're dealing with this royal figure, this redeeming figure, and his enemy is this primordial supernatural power. And when you start putting these things together, you get something which looks very much like the traditional Christian vision of the Messiah.
It's interesting because there's a geometer I know. His name is Tom Bree. He's a British geometer, and he studies the different churches in England. And in the churches and in the iconography of the churches and the way they're aligned and everything, he provided me with this super interesting insight about Venus, which is that Venus is both the morning star and the evening star. Right. And so Venus, in some periods of the year, it basically rises up before the sun and then becomes very bright until the sun appears and then it vanishes. And then in another time of the year, it's in the evening where the sun goes down and then it remains in the heaven right away and then becomes extremely bright as the sun goes down. And his insight was related to what you said, which is that on the one hand, you have this image of the bright star that rises itself up in pride and is eliminated by the sun. And then you have this other one, like a star that's willing to go down into death, basically at the end of the day, but it becomes bright in doing so. And he was talking about this image of, in some ways, Christ and Lucifer as being opposites in that sense, where that Christ was willing to give everything up to be raised up, whereas Lucifer raises himself up and then is cast down. And so I never thought about the suffering servant and this image of the bright star in the garden of the king of Babylon as being chiastically related. So to me, it just kind of adds everything to that.
Yeah. Wow. And I mean that rolls together with this theme that we see across the canon of the transference of authority between angels and human beings, right? What that looks like is different depending on whether the angel is rebellious or it's not rebellious. But we're
Mm.
told in the Psalms and we're told in various parts of the Bible, especially in Hebrews, that God, when he created the world in the beginning, he put it under the administration of those beings, those various kinds of beings that we call angels. They're spiritual beings. They're not corporeal in the sense that we are, but it was always his intention to subject the world to human authority. Now, there is angels who were obedient to God's will and grow mankind up to maturity so that they can hand over the keys. And then there's angels who are rebellious against God and try to resist that. But in the end, both of those groups end up doing their job, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah, yeah.
devil, in doing what he does, ends up bringing about exactly that which he feared. And the angels who are faithful to God in doing what they do end up bringing to pass exactly what they want, which is to bring to pass the incarnation of the Word. So all of these things, which we find laid out, maybe in a clear fashion in the New Testament and in Christian theology, are also found there in Isaiah, not in a less clear fashion, I think, but
Mhm.
actually in a way, in a language that maybe we're just less familiar with.
Yeah,
We don't think in those terms as intuitively.
yeah. And so I want to talk about obviously the suffering servant and the messianic image. So one of the arguments that I've heard obviously against the suffering servant image is that the text is talking about Israel, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is what the text is talking about. It's not talking about a person, it's talking about Israel. And my sense is that it's a fractal thing, that it's both talking about Israel and about the Messiah, but I definitely like to get your take on that.
Yeah. So what is the idea or the kind of distinguishing mark of the Messiah that most people are most familiar with? It's that he's the son of David, right? The Messiah is the heir to David's throne. The messianic promises are made through David, and ultimately the one who fulfills David's covenant, that is going to be the Messiah of Israel. It actually goes deeper than that, but that's, something that pretty universally people
Mhm.
can agree upon. So when people say Isaiah 53 is not about the Messiah, it's about Israel, I just want to respond to them by reading a passage just a couple chapters later, which is part of the same kind of prophetic
Mhm.
narrative arc. And that is Isaiah 55, 3 and following. And God is speaking here to Israel. God is speaking here to the nation. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a commander to the peoples. Behold, you, Israel, shall call a nation you do not know, and nation you did not know shall run to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. So people say Isaiah 53, that can't be about the Messiah because it's about Israel. But Isaiah 55 says that the Davidic covenant is actually going to be fulfilled in the whole nation of Israel. Now, this leads my friends, the biblical critics, to say, well, the author of this chapter, he must have rejected the idea of an individual Messiah because he thought the promise to David would just be fulfilled in the whole nation. He didn't
Yeah.
believe in the Davidic dynasty anymore. But that's not actually the case. When you look at Isaiah 40 to 55, in light of everything that came before, what do we find? We find the idea of seed. And this is what seed is all about. Seed is one thing
Mhm.
which branches out and gives birth to many things which are like it. So go back to Isaiah 6, the call of Isaiah, which in many ways sets the tone of the entire book. It talks about Israel through the refining fire of exile being reduced from a tree to a stump. And it says, the holy, consecrated, chosen seed will be its stump. And Isaiah 11, it speaks of a shoot coming forth
Mhm.
from the stump of Jesse. A branch from his roots will bear fruit. One of the
Mm.
most undisputed messianic prophecies in the whole book of Isaiah. I think almost
Yeah.
nobody debates that this is about the Messiah. But then you go to Isaiah 40 to 55, much of the same language is used. Isaiah 53 speaks about the servant as a root which comes out of dry ground.
Mhm.
And when you read the narrative arc of Isaiah 40 to 55, and this is something we don't have time to go through in detail now, but we will in the class. When you look at this narrative arc, what you see is that God has elected the nation Israel as the nation on whom the destiny of the human family rides. But Israel, even as God extends his hand in mercy to them, continues to rebel and it continues to contract, right? So just compare, for example, the census of Israel in the book of Numbers to the census of Israel in the book of Ezra. The number of Jews, number of Israelites has contracted significantly. It's actually a much smaller nation by this point in history. And what Isaiah shows is that it's going to keep contracting. It contracts down to one person on whom the destiny of the whole nation rides. And we know this because Isaiah 49 says, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified." But then it goes on to say, just a couple verses later, that the mission of this person whom God has just called Israel is to gather Jacob back to him. Well, is it the people who need to be gathered, or is it the person doing the gathering? Well, the king is the head of the whole body. And then we see Israel having been called the servant of the Lord. They're reduced to this one figure. Isaiah 53, the servant, even when it looks like God has abandoned him, remains faithful. And then it says, Isaiah 53, verse 10, he shall see his seed. So this servant now plants seed of his own, which is why in the next chapter, we read about the heritage of these servants of the Lord. Isaiah makes it a plural for the first time in this section of the book in order to emphasize that this one person has now given birth to many people in his family, and they can all be heirs to the promise of David because he is the son of David. They're members of his family. That means they're all members of the house of David, which means God fulfills his covenant with the house of David in this corporate body. So when you pay attention to the way the language is used, it answers many of these kind of traditional objections. Like if you read stuff put out by Jews for Judaism, they say this can't be about Jesus because it says the servant of the Lord has offspring, and Jesus, he didn't have any offspring. Now we can say as Christians, well, he did spiritually. They might not like roll with that. That sounds kind of ad hoc. Well, let's demonstrate it from the text. Who is the servant's wife? There is a wife throughout Isaiah 40 to 55 that's very clear, and it's a city. It's Zion. Zion is the wife of the servant. And that is also really cool because who is Zion's wife throughout the book of Isaiah? It's actually God. So is it God or is it the servant? Or does Zion have two husbands? Well, this
that's
shows us
interesting.
the servant isn't just a man. He's more than a man.
That's super interesting. And so this brings me then to then I guess to just the next logical question, which is, you have this image, of course, of the, this shoot from Jesse, this Messiah that will come and will restore Israel. But what is in Isaiah? What's the relationship to the rest of the nations? Like, how do the rest of the nations participate in this promise?
People sometimes have this idea, and we're going to devote a whole class session to this. People have this idea, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh is just about the Jews. God is very ethnocentric. He's off there destroying a bunch of people because they aren't Jewish. And then the New Testament, God changes character, or the authors of the New Testament have decided they don't like that very much. And so now God likes everyone. He wants all the nations. He doesn't really care about this whole Jewish thing anymore. He's just interested in loving everybody. When you read the Old Testament, actually, if you actually read it straight through, this is not the case. I remember being really struck when I read the Old Testament for the first time straight through, and I wasn't very good at, keeping a discipline going for a long time. So I decided I'm just going to read it through in 1 month. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the whole Old Testament. I'm going to read the whole Bible in 1 month. I'm going to spend several hours every day doing it. By the grace of God, I was able to exceed my natural disposition and actually do that. And what struck me is all of these kind of cliches about how the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are really different. It's not that there were good responses to them. It's just when you read the whole thing so quickly, it's like, no, actually, I don't really feel the difference that people say I'm supposed to feel here. When you read Isaiah, Isaiah makes this especially clear because the book begins with a condemnation of Israel for their sin and their disobedience against God. But then in Isaiah 2, we read about the mountain of the house of the Lord, which in the latter days is going to be lifted up, and the nations of the world are going to stream to it to learn the instruction of the God of Jacob. Now, just a side note here. This is another cool little verbal connection because there's a theme in the book about lifting up. So the mountain is lifted up. In Isaiah 2, we read about the Lord who rises or lifts himself up to terrify the earth, and the nations are going to cast away their idols. That little word, that little theme, that image, that keeps growing throughout the book until we read about the servant of the Lord who is high and lifted up. So just a cool little thing right there. But we read about God as being lifted up. He rises into the vision of the totality of mankind. He comes and he lives here, and the nations of the world, they are all drawn, they're gathered in to this one place. And then that theme just keeps going. We read in Isaiah 19, for example, that in the day of the redemption, God is going to call Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. Now, these are all just classic phrases which denote the chosen people, the people of Israel. But here the prophet is diffusing them among these three nations, two of whom are actually the kind of archetypal enemies, right? Egypt is the power which oppressed Israel in the Exodus. Assyria is the power which is oppressing Israel in this new exile, from which they're going to need a new Exodus. And you keep going and you keep reading, and you read that God is going to gather all the nations into his own fire. And this is a really cool thing about the imagery of Isaiah and the whole Bible, is that language in Scripture is, I like to call it, conceptually flexible. So when you read about God taking fire and torching people, we think, oh, that's really bad. That's a terrible judgment. We read this in Isaiah. God's gonna, he's gonna torch Assyria. He's gonna burn the whole nation down. Actually, what's kind of the establishing image of fire in Isaiah? It's when God takes his fire and puts it on Isaiah himself and forgives his sin. So yeah, fire can mean judgment. It can also mean redemption.
Yeah.
And when you read all of this language together, what you see is that God lays the path open for the redemption of the entire human race by participation in his own divine life, by participation in his own divine fire. And actually that opens the way to seeing some really extraordinary images of the incarnation in the book of Isaiah. People are used maybe to thinking of the incarnation as something where you can have, there's a few texts here and there which show maybe the Messiah is going to be divine, a few proof texts. But, and this is maybe the aspect of Isaiah that I'm most excited about, it runs so much deeper than that.
And one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about this idea of the mountain of Zion that was like lifted up and then all the nations came to it was the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, because that's the king. All the kings of all the nations come, to the wall and offer up their crown to the Lamb and to the Son of Man.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely a very powerful continuation. Between the prophetic images.
And that image actually comes from Isaiah 60, which is a extended development of Isaiah 2, which we just referred to. So it's cool that you just mentioned that, because one of my favorite things about one of my favorite incarnation texts in the book of Isaiah is the chapter that comes right before Isaiah 60. So Isaiah 60 talks about a city filled with a divine presence, i.e. God's presence is there. He lives there. You have communion with God by going there. The nations are going there. The kings of the earth are bringing their gifts to that particular city. But that comes out of this prophecy in Isaiah chapter 59. In Isaiah 59, we have a description of how Israel's whole body is polluted by sin. That's a phrase which begins the book. The whole body is sick from the crown of the head to the sole of the foot. Well, in Isaiah 59, we have a lot of corporeal imagery about this. Your fingers are bloody. Your feet are swift to shed blood. In other words, your whole body is covered with blood. Israel is a sick, sinful, corrupt body. And then it says that God saw that there was a separation between the people and between himself. And he looked and he saw that there was no man to intercede. Now, that's a really important little word right here. And he saw that there was no man to intercede. So he himself, he put on a garment of salvation and a breastplate of righteousness. So we have this bodily terminology about Israel. And then God, he saw that there's no man who's able to do for his people what needs to be done. And he takes human garments, he puts them on himself. And that phrase, no man to intercede, is a very important one because it's an echo of what we read about in Isaiah 53, which is that the servant made intercession for the transgressors. It's not the only word, by the way, which links Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 59, which shows that the God of Israel, who's coming to redeem his people in Isaiah 59 by taking on human garments and doing the job himself, is the same figure as the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53. That can be demonstrated from multiple directions. And then that's how we find ourselves in Isaiah 60 with a city which is filled with the presence of God, which is drawing the nations of the world into it. So we have an incarnational image here, which is explaining why it is that the Gentiles are coming to the city of God. And so 2,000 years ago, there's a Jewish man who the nations came to revere as God. And this is a really striking thing. And this is a point I say a lot in a lot of different contexts because I think it's so striking, but because our lifespan is so limited, we're not surprised by it. Many Orthodox Jews say, well, no, the Messiah has come because we'll be able to look outside. We'll be able to turn on our TVs and we'll be able to just know that he's come. Well, okay, we're used to the world we're brought up in. But I encourage anybody interested to turn on their TV around March, April, around Passover season and watch the stories about tens of thousands of people from the nations of the world who are actually going to Jerusalem to honor a Jewish man who they identify as the Messiah of Israel and in whose name they confess the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nobody could have predicted that 2,000 years ago. If somebody said to a Jew 2,000 years ago, hey, there's going to be this guy, and a couple millennia from now, there's going to be billions of people who know who Moses is, who read the writings of Moses and the prophets because of this guy, they would say, oh, that's the Messiah. That's something you can look out your window when you drive past a church, when you meet Gentiles named Jeremiah or Moses or Daniel. Or Jonathan, right? Yeah. Like, where is this coming? This is an extraordinary fact. And we can't stop being surprised and amazed by that. Now, that's not just knowing that doesn't prove Jesus is the Messiah, but it should catch your attention. And my argument here is, okay, now that your attention, God willing, has been caught, let's work through the text. Let's look at the details. Let's see how this works in the whole story of the Tanakh. Let's see how it holds together. And I really think that when you look at that, when you see that and study it, you find Jesus of Nazareth, whose work actually is articulated in a way which is very consonant with how the Orthodox Church describes the ministry and the work of Jesus. That this is about the deification of mankind, the lifting of mankind to sharing the glory of God through the incarnation, that God became man so that we can become God. That's something that you find in the language of the Old Testament. You don't need to just appeal one or two texts in the New Testament. It's the whole story that God made the world to live in it, to live in us and with us and through us. And he joins himself with the world through the incarnate Jesus Christ.
Well, I'm definitely getting excited about this, because I mean, obviously I've read Isaiah several times, but I've never definitely gone through and really kind of worked it out. And sometimes, sometimes you realize there are things we believe as Christians, and then we don't know where they come from. And one of the aspects in the last years that I've seen is that I can go back to Isaiah and find some of these in the imagery and in the interrelationships of images. So I'm definitely looking forward to doing that with you. And so, what are you hoping that this will do? Like, what are you hoping that this class will do for people?
I want people, number one, to recognize that Christ is really disclosed to us in the Old Testament. That is, we can know Christ better by studying the Old Testament. And if you just go in blind to the Old Testament, it's just, you're overwhelmed or drowned by the imagery. It's too much. You can't deal with it all at once. You need some places to kind of catch your foot on and get started. So I want to give people the tools to know Christ in the Old Testament. there's an apologetic motivation to this
Yeah.
as well. Apologetics, I don't think, should necessarily be our primary motivation in doing good exegesis, but it's something which grows out of that. So this is something which was very meaningful for me, um, working through Isaiah at a time where still, like, I was wrestling with questions about, was any of this real? Is Jesus really here? And just finding that, no, I wasn't getting this from like reading some apologetic article. I was just reading
Mm,
Isaiah, and these things were leaping out at me. And I would say,
mm.
is this actually there? And I'd double and I'd triple and I'd quadruple check. And I'd find, oh my gosh, this is actually there. I mean, there's a few moments that still kind of stick with me, and just kind of like looking up from the text and being like, literally, oh my God, this is real. So I want people to come to have that kind of same experience, that, wow, this story I'm reading about, it's not just some like LARP we're doing on the internet, like, oh, I'm really into the Bible and stuff. No, this is real. This is the story of the world. This is what it's all about.
Yeah.
I also want people to appreciate the way that symbolism unites the Bible together, and unites the Bible with Orthodox liturgy and
Yeah.
iconography and all that kind of stuff, because symbolism is the Bible's native tongue. Symbolism is also the native tongue of the liturgical tradition, hymnography. Many times, looking at scripture, I talked about this a little bit in my last class. We'll talk about it more in this one. Reading scripture, notice a kind of relationship between something in the between that passage and something in the liturgy that helps me understand the liturgy better. And then I read some traditional commentary in the liturgy, and I find they're not making that exact connection between that
Yeah.
passage, but they're explaining what this action means in the same way, which says, okay, this is a real connection. It's not just something I'm making up. So I want people to be able to see our tradition in a more cohesive, integrated way, which I think helps show that this is a real feature of the world. It's not something we're imposing on it. This really is the key to reality.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about sometimes talking about symbolism or hearing people talk about it is how sometimes the weave is so tight that you're mentioning an analogy and you're talking about it, and there's one right next to it that's just glaring, right? And so you're talking about it, and then the other person, like, let's say I hear someone do that, and I'm like, wait, there's this other, and it's like, it just says itself, right? Once you see it, it's like the other part just appears, even if the person isn't explicitly doing it. When I read the Fathers, I see that all the time, where, there are places especially in St. Gregory of Nyssa, where he's weaving this idea of, let's say, circumcision and removing the garments of skin, and then some things he'll say, some things he won't, and then you can, all of a sudden, all these other images just flood into your mind. We're like, oh, this is what that's about. This is what that's about, and so it kind of connects everything together.
Yeah.
And so I am, Sarah, I'm definitely looking forward to taking your class. And so everyone, you have to go and check it out. It's starting June 15th. And how many classes is it?
There's going to be 5 classes. They'll be live at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard. But as with other Symbolic World stuff, you can always watch it asynchronously. There's going to be Q&A in the class. You can ask questions. If you can't watch live, you can post questions in the little forum associated with the class. So it'll be 5 classes, 2 hours each, 10 hours total. And I'm super excited for it. And we were talking about this a little bit before we got on. You said that you didn't want me to give away the whole class here. And kind of what you said relates to that this is something which compounds. Like, I could talk about Isaiah for 10 hours, and all that would do is give me and you and everyone else 100 hours more things to say about it, because with every connection, it generates 10 more connections. And the coolest thing, the paradoxical thing, the extraordinary thing is that all of these connections are all really there, because what's inside the world is the logi of the God who is infinite. And that's what the Bible is all about as well.
All right. Thanks, Seraphim. It was great to talk to you, and we can't wait for your class. So thanks, everyone. Go to symbolicworld.com. You can obviously sign up to the symbolicworld.com itself, and then you can also find Seraphim's class, which is coming very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.